Good day, everybody, and welcome to our session of Taste of Techstars. Today, we're going to be focused on investors. How do you run an investment process? How do you get investment for your business? Hannah and I will be leading this session today, and the format that we're going to use is going through kind of an overview with some examples, and then in each section that we're talking about, we'll give specifics that what we're seeing among the investors that we work with, specifically around investing in companies associated with sustainability. And then given the interesting times that we're in right now, we'll also go over some of the differences or unique perspectives that are present right now, given the current fundraising environment and the situation around us. As a reminder, our program brings in 10 sustainability-focused companies per year. We have a 3-month program where it's a very intensive, where we try to really, help the business move forward. And investment's a key part of that for the companies that choose to invest. So we're taking some of the concepts that we teach during program and some of the guidance that we give and help that we give in program, bottling that up for you today and presenting a 1-hour overview into kind of the high-level do's and don'ts of investing. With that, let's dive in. Hannah, as you want to add things in, feel free to hop in. What I want to talk about first is just kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. So the key thing that we're going to talk about first is preparing to fundraise. Just jump right into it. So we're going to talk about the dynamics of the preparation side of that, and then we're going to get into the actual process of raising funds. And like I said, we'll include examples that we have from companies that we've worked with, from investors that we've worked with, and specifics about what we're seeing over the last month or two. Hannah, did you have anything to add before we dive in?
No, just feel free to add your questions as we go along, either in the event chat or the Q&A, and we can kind of try to answer those as they come up.
Awesome. Okay, so the first question that I like to ask, entrepreneurs will come to us and say, okay, I'm ready to fundraise. And the first place I like to start is, should you even raise money? Is this what you want for yourself and for your business? The first piece of that is really understanding what kind of business do you want to create? Are you more interested in a business that doesn't have a lot of outside influence from a board or from investors, where you really want to have a very intentional direction that you want to take the company and you don't want to have any sort of governance over the direction that you want to take? Or do you want to build a company for scale and their capital needs that are required to really hit scale for the business? So that's the first thing to understand is you kind of break this into kind of two buckets, the psychology side and the dynamics of the business side. So I think it's important to understand, what does it mean to take money from investors? And I like to divide it up into two different camps: angel investors and institutional investors. The difference there is angel investors are typically investing their own money or kind of smaller amounts of family money. And so they have a personal connection to their money. It's literally theirs. With institutional investors, they're investing somebody else's money. So they take money from limited partners who provide capital into those investment firms, and then the partners of those firms invest into startups. The idea here, ultimately what everybody wants is to give you money as an investment, and like any investment, they want to receive more money back over some period of time. Now, with startup investing, especially early investing, the dynamics of that are, most investors know that it's high risk. So it's not like, investing in a local utility or a bond. This is high risk capital. And for high risk capital to work, there needs to be high returns. Now, the way they look at it is, because it's high risk, there's not necessarily high returns that are going to come from every company. For institutional investors, typically how those funds work best is if there are they understand the math of the power laws of investing in startups, is there will be one or two companies that return most of the capital from that fund. So what institutional investors are looking for are companies where they can see the opportunity for that particular company to return all of the capital that was invested out of that fund and then some. So this is a 10 times, 20 times, even 100 times return on early investment. That's a dynamic they're looking for. They realize not every company is going to be able to do that in their portfolio. So they take a portfolio approach, try to spread that risk out cumulatively over a portfolio. But they're really looking for that one or the potential for a really big upside gain off of the investment. On the other side, angel investors, yeah, they want that same dynamic of return or similar dynamic, but often they're investing more in the idea, the passion for the entrepreneur, for you, what you're doing, and the kind of relationship side of that. When you invest in, or if you take money from an institutional investor, the liquidity event at the end or how they get their money back plays a huge role in your interaction with them over time and what they're looking for. Very rarely ever can you buy an angel out. It happens, but it's kind of an interesting dynamic. And over time, those institutional investors will often take board seats in the company. That's part of their governance structure and their ability to help you. What I really encourage you to think about is on the, what do you want for your business side? Do you want that dynamic of having these investors with you? It's also important to think about you're not just receiving money from the investor. Especially in the early stage, you should be receiving counsel, you should be receiving mentorship, expertise. So it's important to not just look at the fund that the institutional investors are part of, or the angel investors kind of shows up and says hi. It's important to look at their backgrounds and understand, other than their money, how much can they add to this business? And if you're in a strong fundraising position, I really encourage you to take advantage and really optimize for not just the money that comes in, but really focus on what value can they add holistically to your business? How can they help you change the market and create the impact you're trying to create with your business? Let's assume that you decide to raise money. The next step is targeting the investor list, figuring out which investors are appropriate and would be good additions into your business. The key thing here is do your research. Understand these investors, understand their backgrounds, understand prior investments that they've made. Look at their portfolio pages if they're institutional investors, and if they're angel investors, ask around trying to understand either through Crunchbase or other people in the community about what type of investments that they've done. This is really critical because you don't want to build a list of investors that aren't going to be helpful to your business. Because often a very common first question that an investor will have, or what they want to see in those introductions, is the appreciation that you've done your work and you can express to them, using the language of their firm and their focus, why your company is interesting and how you can contribute to the change that they're trying to create. There's a couple of important tactics to doing this. So that's sort of the philosophy of fundraising and doing the research. There's some really powerful tactics that you can do. Often when we work with companies and they say, okay, I'm ready to fundraise, can you help me fundraise? Can you help make introductions? A question I like to ask is, okay, show me your investor pipeline. Show me who you're targeting and why. And then let's dig into our networks and understand how we can be helpful. Very often the answer we get back is, well, I've got some sticky notes, or I've got it in my email, or yeah, I've got a couple of sheets, Google Sheets here, and I got a list. What I like to see is a concrete list, something we can interact with, something we can collaborate around. Because I find the early part of this research, it's best when you can collaborate with key mentors and key people in your network. Because the reality is almost no investments ever happen off of a cold outreach. This is a community. So people are looking for a relationship. They're looking for people vouching for each other. And so being able to insert yourself into those networks through warm introductions is really critical. And that's why collaborating around a list of investors is really powerful. Let me show you an example here of a template that one of our managing directors, Jenny Fielding, has created. And this is a good investor pipeline template. So let me just kind of go through the columns here. What I encourage you to do is create a document that then you can share with a limited number of folks that you trust so that you can collaborate around these introductions. So it's important to put the fund name in here, the investor that you're targeting, because again, with institutional investors, usually there's a partnership. So there's an overall fund, and then there are individual partners. So getting down to the partner level is important. Identifying who within that partnership is most likely to find your business interesting. Think about fund size. This is important because if the fund is too large, they're not going to be able to write appropriately sized checks for the round that you're investing. So matching up the money that you think you need from the investment, the amount you're raising, with the overall fund size is important. That usually reduces down into overall check size. That's really what you want to target. Now, very rarely ever does an investor on a website put their typical check size. So this, you have to often do a little bit of digging to understand. You can use a little bit of math, assuming that over a 4-year life of the fund, taking a guess at kind of their thesis around how many investments they'll do, you can back into check size. Are they willing to lead investments? Not all investors are willing to lead. And we see within the Techstars network that at least first fundraises out when companies come out of our program. So this is seed, kind of pre-seed to small A rounds. We see about half of those not actually have a lead. The terms are set by the company. That works in early stage funding, like the seed level. Later stage, B round, C round, you'll need a lead that's setting the terms. But early on, it's good to know, are they willing to lead? Have they shown signs of leading? And you can usually get this from Crunchbase or other areas to see if they've led other investments in other companies. Note the fund themes. Some investors are thematic, some are geographic, but identify what the kind of affinity to your company is here, either location or the type of companies that they look to support. For impact investors that are specific on impact, sometimes they'll describe a theory of change that they're trying to pursue with their investment firm, so write that here. Relevant portfolio companies. Are there other companies that are not exactly like yours but could be adjacent, to get a feel for their investment habits and their portfolio? It's important with institutional investors, when you look at their portfolio, if there's a company that's offering the same or similar value proposition to the same or similar customers as you, it's very unlikely they're going to invest. When an institutional investor says yes to one company, they are saying no to every other company in the similar space because they don't want conflicts of interest. When they back a company, they really want to back that company. So don't waste your time if you've identified an investor that's already invested in one of your competitors. Last contact, this can be important for noting, when you last interacted with this person. We'll show you here in a minute how we shift this into the process outside of this spreadsheet. Note the email, the location, additional notes. Now, when you start collaborating with this field is really important here. The who can introduce you. One of the ways that is really powerful with a spreadsheet like this, again, as I said, collaborating with your network, your trusted handful of advisors, is to walk them through this spreadsheet or share this spreadsheet with them and ask them, who on this list can you help me with an introduction? Because again, the likelihood that an investor will respond to you is dramatically higher if you have a warm introduction. So this is your opportunity to send this into your advisors, trusted people around your business, and ask them, who here knows this person well enough that you'd be willing to make an introduction for me? That's critical. So once you have this built, build out with as many investors as seems appropriate. I've seen these spreadsheets with 150, 200 investors in them. I've seen versions of these that have 10 or 20. It's important to have done your research, put as many in here as relevant for you as you can. There are several lists out there. Silicon Valley Bank has one. There's been a pretty interesting list that we compiled that's up on the techstars.com/COVID page that has a list of active investors right now. I find that this is a really powerful way to get your house in order so you can run an effective process. Anna, do you want to share some stories that you have around how you've collaborated with entrepreneurs on a spreadsheet like this and the process of introductions?
Sure, and that makes me think too. Amasa VC has some great climate-focused lists, one for the U.S., Asia, and one for Europe. So I'll be sure to pull those up and share those in the chat for you all as well. Couple of thoughts. One thing is it's okay that spreadsheet Zach just showed to share it with, say it's your top 20 trusted advisors and network people. It's okay to share the same list with them. And then, hopefully they'll be like, oh, well, Zach made 5 introductions, and they'll see who's making the intros, and it might help them like get a little encouraged to be like, I want to make sure, I pull my weight here too in helping. So don't feel like you have to copy that and send a different copy to every person. It's okay if they're all in that same one together. It might help encourage them to make a few more intros. Another thing, just on the first part, Zach was talking about on the should you raise. If you haven't read Venture Deals, I definitely recommend reading it because one, it's a really easy entrepreneur-friendly way to kind of talk about all of the everything you need to know about investing. But the other thing it does is help you understand the venture capital perspective that Zach started to go in. And though you're not, needing to run a venture capital firm, if you're a founder, if you understand what's motivating those VCs, you're going to be better able to kind of empathize with them and understand what they need to be successful, and therefore help them be successful and also help you. And then the other, Zach, do you want me to talk about relevant kind of ecosystem today now, or should I kind of wait till the end?
No, let's dive into that now.
Yeah, the other part around kind of should you raise, I'd say right now is, it's always the first question you should be asking, but it's a really important question. And if there's a way in which you do not have to be raising right now, especially if you haven't started at all and you're not in the process and you haven't been building those relationships, I would definitely encourage folks to think about how they can do that. Maybe there's consulting, there's something you can do on the side, or kind of really focus on revenue, or if you have the run rate, really focusing on product or kind of doubling down on things that aren't raising. And now kind of what we're about to go into and building the pipeline and everything, now could be a really great time to really build out an awesome pipeline and do all this research, because it does take a lot of time. And so make use of the time you might have now that isn't flying around meeting with investors, but you can spend the time kind of building out this list really well so you're ready, and then, of course, updating it along the way as things kind of change in the ecosystem. So yeah, and I think just to double down on the doing your homework, I get outreach all the time from people that are like, invest in my, B2B SaaS consumer app that has nothing to do with sustainability. I'm just like, what? You look stupid. Like, if you had done 1 ounce of research on me, you would have seen, like, that's not where I invest. And so really making sure that you know who you're reaching out to and you understand them. Even like looking at the person's Twitter and their personal blog and things like that. So yeah, that's all I got now. If you want to keep flowing, and then I can add some more notes as we go along.
Awesome. That's great advice around kind of the current times and the kind of research that goes into this. Next part is around the introduction emails. And again, if you're not actively fundraising, it still can be, as Hannah mentioned, relevant to start to begin to build these relationships. There are many companies that I work with that their investors, they built a relationship over 1, 2, 3 years before they invested. We had an investor in our company that we were working with probably 5 years, 6 years before they finally invested. So sometimes these can be, really long-term relationships that you're trying to create, so that when the time is right for both sides, it works out and you get the investment. The next place that I want to jump to is going into the introductory side. You've built your spreadsheet, you've reached out to trusted mentors, they've given you, identified ones where they can introduce. Now, what do you do? How do you go from here? So let's say a mentor is willing to make an introduction to an investor. What does that process look like? The thing to optimize for is ease for the investor or for the mentor that's going to introduce you. You want to make it as easy as possible on them while still maintaining the fidelity of your message. So there's kind of a balancing act here. The easiest thing for the person introducing you is to take an email that you have, that they have, and just simply forward it on to the investor with a little bit of, vouch or extra information on top. So the thing I'd like to show next is, okay, what does that email look like? Let me show you an example here that we use to help work with entrepreneurs. And this is an example from a situation where you're trying to get an introduction into an investor through a mentor. So in this example, what we see here is Cody is the person who's willing to introduce here, and Angel is the person we're trying to get an introduction into the investor. So at the beginning, it's a little bit of an explanation to the mentor, but you've already chatted with them. They know what's going on here. So this little preamble is to help establish the connection. It's almost your chance to build a bridge and credibility between the person introducing you and yourself. That you've got some credibility, you've got a vouch from the mentor that's introducing you. There's also some more details here about opportunities to connect. Right now we're not traveling, but chances where, similar connection circles or similar online events, maybe an opportunity to look for targets of opportunity to get the attention of the investor. And then finally, it's important at the end to put a blurb about your company because you don't want to put it on the mentor to describe your company. One, there's a high likelihood they won't get it exactly right. And number two, that's a lot of work for the person introducing you. In an ideal situation, that person may be introducing you to 5, 6, 7, 10, 15 people. And you want each of those transactions to be very easy on the mentor, very easy on the act of introducing. So this can be a really quick thing to do. What I like to see as well, is each time you're tweaking the company introduction, the blurb at the bottom, or the context at the top to be specific to the investor. Now, you don't have to rewrite the whole email from scratch. It's fine to have a template, but it's important to make that connection to enable, through the simplicity of the email, to still carry a little bit of the fidelity of, hey, investor, I've done my homework. I understand your interest areas. Here's what specifically about our company that I think you might find interesting. And it's about brevity, but it's also about the continuity of that message. I'll stop sharing here. And the other thing that's really important is to keep track of who made the introduction. Because as you're going through this and you're getting introduced to 20, 30, 40 people, you're going to lose track of, unless you have a system, of who introduced you. The other thing you want to be really careful of is to not ask for multiple introductions into the same partnership in a way that's awkward for the partners. That's a great way, if you're doing an institutional raise, to really get some frustration. It's also not great to take multiple introducers into the same person. I've seen examples of that where an entrepreneur gets ambitious and think, well, one introduction, if one introduction's good, 10 will probably be great. And literally triangulate into the same person 10 different ways. And that's really awkward on the mentor. It does not look good on the mentor, the person introducing you. And it doesn't show well for the investor. Yeah, there's an edge of ambition there, but there's this kind of fine line between being engaged and sort of feeling like you're stalking the person. And if you get those 10 introductions inbound into one person, that can really feel awkward for that investor. So please don't do that. All right, Hannah, anything to add before we jump on to other materials that are important once you start to get the introductions?
I'll just make a note here. Given the current context, I think one thing that's happening is the bar for fundraising is just higher right now. And so things like this are going to help you stand out. And there's a lot of other things that your focus should be building in a great company and have that company stand out as well. But on top of that, really following tight processes, these things that Zach is talking about, and we're going to keep talking about, are good all the time. But I think especially now, it's going to really help you rise above maybe some of the other competition for fundraising right now. Oh, and also with this introductions and emailable stuff, one thing to never, ever, ever do that can be tempting is to bulk email people and do a mail merge that, you're like, oh, hi, Seth at Foundry Group. Don't do that. Make every email personal and specific. And because chances are high you're going to mess up your mail merge and Seth is going to get, hi, Brad, or something to him. And so be personal, be specific, show that you've done your research. Don't ever, it's really tempting, but don't mail merge these.
Great advice. All right, and the next place I'd like to jump to is what are the other supporting materials? So let's say you get an introduction and you get the first meeting. What is it important to have as you prepare for that first meeting and present? So typically the first meeting will be kind of a more casual get to know. With an angel investor, it can be pretty straightforward. With institutional investors, there's usually a much kind of more refined and involved process. But it all starts with that first meeting. What I like to do is build that a deck that you can go through. Occasionally what you'll get is an investor asking you, well, can you email me a deck beforehand? I'd like to learn more. I'll cover that in the next piece. While that may be the actual next step in the process, I actually want you to build the meeting deck for the in-person meeting first. The reason for this is it's really important for you to get your story right. What's the story you want to tell about the business? This is similar to the same process we go through when we help companies with their demo day pitch. It's really about the story. The kind of at a high level, I mean, this isn't a session on how to do pitches or demo day pitches. The key thing that I like to think about with the story is just like any story that you read or see on TV or watch in a movie, being mindful of who are the characters in the story and what point of view are you telling the story through. Very often what happens that I see is that the story is told from the perspective of the product of the business. What I like to see is help me understand who the customer is, what problem the customer has, and how you make that problem go away with your product or your offer. And so often the default for me is tell the story of your business through the eyes of your customers or prospective customers. The other thing that's common about these initial decks that I see is they're very oriented, almost like a sales deck, because typically at this point, you're either going to have a sales deck that's working or you'll have a prototype sales deck that you've been using. Don't turn your sales deck into your pitch deck because you're not selling a customer on buying your product. You're selling an investor on investing in your company. The audience is different and the dynamics of the story are different. In a pitch meeting, you're talking about your business and the components of your business. You're not just talking about the product. So think about that story, build a compelling story about your business, share that with mentors, share that with advisors, people in your network, ask people that in your network, other founders who successfully raised money. Hey, could I see the deck that you used to raise money? Curious how you did it. Don't copy their deck, but use it to get a sense of what was the arc, what was the story, and really pay attention to the story side of it. The graphics are important, they're supportive, but the key thing is get the story right. Once you've got the story right in a minimal deck that you feel comfortable presenting to an investor, Then what I encourage you to do is take that deck and add details. Think about the key things that you would talk about if you were presenting that deck in person, and add that textually into the deck. Because if you're emailing a deck, that it needs to stand on its own. Some entrepreneurs choose to create a one-pager, which is a one-page overview, again, of that same story of your business, and just send that. And if an investor asks for a deck, they send the one-pager. It really depends on how compelling your story is and how much proof and confidence you have in that story being able to stand on its own. So if you have a product that has a rather complicated demo or it's a nuanced market, requires some explanation, it may be better to send that one pager to give a compelling overview that gets the investor excited, but then save the actual details for that in-person meeting. The other thing that can be helpful too in this process of formulating your deck is when we think about building the investor pipeline or that list of all the investors. I also encourage you to think about, is this a dream investor we would love to have? Is this a good investor? Is this maybe not a great investor for us? The good investor is one that's maybe not the top tier investor in the space, but they're aligned with your space. They understand what you're doing. They understand your market. They understand companies like yours. And it can be powerful to begin getting feedback on the story you're telling about your business by starting with the investors in that B category. So people who understand your market, but maybe aren't the top 3 investors or 10 investors that you would love to have. Use those meetings as a way to gather data and feedback about your presentation, your process, the story that you're telling about your business. The key thing there is that if the first couple of times that you're telling the story don't go well, you don't want to burn that opportunity with your top investors. It can feel like with investment, one of our partners at Techstars said, the investment process can feel like take 50 grit sandpaper and just rub it on your hip for a few days. So it's painful. We get it. You want to be done with it and over soon. So, the ideal thing is you pitch one investor, you get a yes, and that investor says, I'll take the whole round. That almost never happens. You have to grind through kind of the early days of getting your message really honed in. So I encourage you to do that on people who will give you good feedback, but maybe aren't your absolute top investors. When you feel like the message is working well and you're getting good response from it, then switch into getting those connections into those top kind of A investors. Another question that often comes up in the deck or will come up in early conversations is, how much are you raising and why? To answer that question, there's a couple of different approaches I've seen. The easy approach that doesn't lend to great answers is, well, all the companies in our space that are about our size and are far along, we're all raising about $1 million. So we're raising $1 million. What I encourage you to do is build a financial model. We don't have time to get into the details of a financial model and how to construct them today. But what I like to make sure that you have is a financial model. So if an investor says, why this amount of money? Why is this the appropriate amount of money? You can walk them through a model that shows, and I like to see one kind of bottom up built, meaning from what are the costs and the dimensions and the dynamics of creating customers? How does that scale up and then ultimately lead into product revenue or service revenue? And then how does that roll up into your overall revenue picture? That then gives a market picture that shows how fast can you grow into the market, and how fast do you need to grow expenses within the business to link up with the growth in the market. Angel investors tend to be more open to knowing that this money is going to be used to address fundamental risks in the business. Institutional investors tend to want to have some of those fundamental risks worked out before they're willing and able to invest. And really the fundamental risk in early stage startups is, can you turn a prospect into a customer reliably at a reasonable price? And can you build a product that makes their problem go away? And can you build it in a compelling way? Those are the two fundamental risks that angel investors can be really helpful to provide money to solve those risks. Angels, institutional investors, through your model, through your market evidence, and product demos are going to want to know that those two fundamental risks to some degree have been addressed. Last couple of things to think about is making sure that you're ready if investors do get excited and interested. So they're going to want to be able to look at some of your founding documents, making sure that your IP is protected, you've got appropriate documents in place with contractors, with employees, basically have your house in order legally and your house in order from a document standpoint. This is also understanding, cap table, being able to describe who owns what percent and in what format of the company. This can be easy when it's, one or a few founders and you all own common shares, but it can get more nuanced if you already have institutional investors that are taking on preferred rights. As Hannah already mentioned, but for a great explanation of all the dynamics of the preferred rights and kind of the legal and entrepreneurial side of the actual fundraising mechanics and the documents, Venture Deals is, in my opinion, the best book out there. Highly encourage you to read that if you're in that kind of, institutional fundraising process. It's also really good for angels as well, but there's some just essential information in that book if you're raising from institutional investors. That's what I have on kind of preparing the fundraise. Hannah, what else would you like to add? And then we'll move into the actual process once you get into the middle of the fundraising process.
Yeah, I think one thing, there was a question kind of about quarterly emails and if those should be individual or bulk. Those can be bulk, definitely. That's a email that is sent on a consistent basis. I recommend once a month, that kind of gives an update of your progress to key stakeholders. And this is really key to building relationships along the way, staying warm, staying in touch, asking for help, getting support. And so that email is definitely okay to be bulk. And you can mail merge it and kind of insert the person's name. The ones that should be specific are when you're asking for a meeting and asking for warm introductions. And one thing to just mention, all of this is really, really important and still all extremely relevant given the context of the world right now. And, investors are starting to take remote meetings. I was talking to an investor and he was just like, yeah, and I never thought I would ever, take a founder meeting. Like it would be okay to kind of just have remote meetings instead of in person. And now it is okay. People are shifting along that. One thing I have been seeing is investors are more likely to be continuing conversations with current relationships versus building new relationships. And so focusing on definitely if you already have anyone committed into your round, try to close that round as soon as possible. Don't optimize for anything, just close the round. But any relationships you started to build, continue to be working on those relationships. And I would, if you can, again, now you might want to wait 3 to 6 months or a little bit of time to be kind of building new relationships from scratch, unless, you're like, hey, I know this VC firm's still fundraising. I hit all 3 of their investment theses. This is why, I read all their blogs and I know exactly that, I am perfect for this VC firm. Those are ones maybe to still be reaching out to, but in general, I would be thinking now, and we're about to kind of go into this around network and relationships, but really be thinking about using this time wisely, building out that list, the lead list, starting to build relationships in any way you can, and making sure that the timing is good for you and for the VC firm and the market for when you kind of start to make these asks. And the investor update email is a great way to be building these kind of touch points along the way.
Great context. Thank you. All right, let's shift into running the process. You've got your house in order, you've got your documents ready, you've got your deck built, you're ready to tell your story or at least test your story. Now, how do we shift? Where do we Where do we go from here? As Hannah mentioned, leveraging your network is really key. And if you don't have a network, then kind of the initial process is, okay, how do I bootstrap that network? And a good way to do that is, people in your geography who have a passion for early stage startups, have a passion for entrepreneurs, and just, enjoy being very connected into the local network. Get yourself inserted into that. Great ways to do this are volunteering for entrepreneurial organizations, volunteering for, local events that are happening. I mean, right now, those are all going to be online, but trying to insert your way in of like, how can I give back into this community before I start asking for things? I've had entrepreneurs before, come to me and say, okay, well, I'm just about out of money. What can you do to help me? Almost like it's sort of our problem that they're out of money. Please don't, that's not an effective way to run a process. Generally with angel investors, you want to give yourself kind of that 3 to 6 months. With institutional investors, some of the best fundraisers I know, they're always spending time building their network, building their fundraising infrastructure. So even when they don't have an ask, they're still taking meetings appropriately, kind of, percentage of their week. So that's not all they're doing. But when it comes up, when there's opportunities, they're still engaging, they're taking those meetings. And it's great when you can build those relationships when the investor doesn't think that there's an ask on the other end. So imagine, put yourself in the shoes of an investor. Yeah, their job is to invest money. And most of the time they're interacting with people who want something from that investor. So a great way to get these initial conversations going is to actually not need anything from that person. View it from more of a two-directional side, which is, yeah, what you want is that relationship and future opportunities that could come with it. But think about what's valuable to this investor. In this moment, what are some things that I have that potentially could be valuable to them? And, think about those dynamics so that when you're in these meetings, when you're in these interactions, it can feel a little bit more two-sided, like you have something to offer for them and some way to better their world or better the work that they're doing. So keep that in mind. Leveraging your network is critical. Warm introductions are key. Cold outreach to investors is almost never works. You can look at pitch competitions. You can look at other events in your industry where investors are likely to attend and get involved in those and get your company focused or featured in those environments. And that's a great way to get on investors' radars. Again, if you sense kind of a theme in all of this is it can take time. So that's why it's really important to build this muscle and build these habits and patterns into your business, into your operations before you need to, really tap into that network. Now let's shift to the process. We talked about creating that list of investors, the potential investor list. Now let's say that you're engaged in the actual fundraising process. You've begun the process and now you're diligent about it. What I encourage you to do is either you're running a process or you're not. It's nearly impossible to run half a fundraising process, which is, well, I'll kind of dabble in fundraising, but I got a business to run. What I would encourage you to do is when it's time to fundraise, really lean into it. You can test this beforehand by, if you already have existing relationships, again, with mentors or with investors, and get some time on their calendar to describe your business and get their advice, get their feedback. What are the investment dynamics you're seeing? Is it the right time for us to raise? What are some of the milestones or goals that you'd like to see us get to before you think it's time to really run a proper process? Because when you run the process, you want to get through it. Time is key. The thing that I see often is you start running a process, see the entrepreneur kind of hit a snag or get distracted, and they lose traction. Fundraising, in my experience, is a very kind of inertia or momentum-driven activity. Once you get going, that momentum can really take you. And if that momentum stalls, either because of macro environment, but often because the entrepreneur gets distracted. You can lose that momentum, and it's easy for a round to fall apart quickly and take some time to build up. So just always keep that momentum going. What I'm going to show next is a process that I like to use. You don't have to use this exact methodology, but thinking about shifting from list of investors to managing your process of investing. There are many tools that you can use to do that. I'm going to show two. You can adapt these into your own tools that you have available. Some entrepreneurs that I work with like to have a Trello board and manage the process that way. And what we're shifting to now is thinking about what are the steps that the investor goes through from the initial kind of introduction into the various forms of engagement and then ultimately in the investment. So map out. This allows you to think through, okay, what is the process that I need to go through? How do I move an investor through this process? And what are their natural process that they like to follow? It's good to start this early on in the process. Once you have that introduction, you have some connection into the investor. When you have the card, however you choose to manage it, I like to create a link back into your list of investors spreadsheet, because you don't want to double enter. You don't want to enter all the information that's in that spreadsheet into whatever system you're using to manage the process. It's kind of clunky to do that. There's a cool feature if you use Google Spreadsheets where you can link to it, and instead of just linking into the particular sheet, you can link into the exact cell. So in this case, I've created the link to this specific firm name so that on the card, I can go exactly into this. When there's one item in the spreadsheet, pretty obvious which one you're focused on. But if you have 100 items in here, you're going to want to link directly into that row of that spreadsheet. To do this in Google Sheets, when you have a cell, just say get linked to this cell, and that will enable you to copy that link into whatever system that you're using. Another thing that I find that's important is, this is an add-on to Trello, but it shows you how long this card has been in this particular list. As I mentioned before, that notion of keeping the momentum going, this allows you to see which cards or which investors are stalling out at the different parts of your process, and you can pay attention to those, rank the cards based on the ones that are most important to you, and then also look at the ones that have aged, that you're losing momentum, you're losing contact with them. And then think about what's the process. So here we've got columns. So if I've got an introduction into this example investor, and then I go through the process of getting it scheduled, then I move this example investor into the scheduled first meeting. Then when you've had that meeting, then put it in here. I encourage you, in whatever system that you're using, to have next steps, have tasks that are associated with this. So I've got, let's say we've confirmed their interest, we've scheduled them on the calendar. I probably do that, and then I put them into the first scheduled meeting. After this meeting, if you've got to-dos that come up, follow-up items, put them into here. You may also then need to transcribe them into whatever to-do system that you use to make sure you lose track of them. But this gives you one place to look where you can see all the activity across your entire pipeline of investors. At a super high level, the stages that are common in an investment is you've got that initial introduction, you've scheduled that first meeting. Once you've had the first meeting, usually there's some next steps around that or some poking or prodding. If you're an institutional investor, there typically is going to be a partner meeting where you present to all the partners in the firm. But with an angel, it may just be a second meeting or ongoing meetings. There's a notion here of soft circled. This is where the investor says, yes, I'm willing to invest. There may be some conditions to that investment that you have to work through, like valuation, finding a lead, location of the company, other types of dynamics. But this is where you get them, and it's really critical as an entrepreneur to get them to say, yes, I commit to your round. Okay, if there's some caveats to them, but this is where to note. So put that investor, if they're soft circled, put them into here. And then a critical thing to do is, if there are conditions to their investment, make sure that you note them here in the next steps or in the description. You want to remember exactly what those conditions are to their investment. Because the last thing you want to do is violate one of those conditions and still claim that they're going to be an investor. Usually there's some paperwork involved. So when you have paperwork from the investor, put it there. Signed paperwork is good. But again, the ultimate thing, and make sure you have this column, which is we have the money in the bank. Entrepreneurs tend to get what I call happy ears, where they hear a yes, and until the money's in your account, it's not truly a yes. So I like to have that here. It's often the case where you get into diligence, you get into working with the investors, and you're excited about them, they're excited about you, but you both realize that you're at the wrong stage for the investments they like to do. And so put the investor here into maybe next round. Again, this is starting to now set yourself up for the next fundraise. And you're probably in your mind, you're thinking, I just want to get this raise done. But this helps you create that bench of investors and engagement for your next round. Then if investors pass, put them in the past. It's once they say no to you, it's really frustrating for investors if you continue to pester them to get them from a no back to a yes. So put them in the past. They're done. They're there. Move on. You can also use another example I'll give here is much more closely tied to email. So if you happen to use Gmail, this is Streak, which is an add-in. It's a customer relationship add-in into Gmail. We use it in our program. It's got some wrinkles, but it tends to be a pretty powerful tool. So this allows you, again, thinking about the same kind of stages that an investor could go through. Now you're moving those people into those stages using this tool. It's very well linked into Gmail and the email flow. So it can help you kind of, if email is the center of your world and driving that process, it can be really good for that. What I encourage you to do is think about throughout all of this process, be mindful of where the investor is in the process, be very mindful of next steps, and be thinking about always moving that momentum forward. One of the critical things to move the momentum forward is if they send you an email, don't sit on it. Even if you struggle with email, be good at email during this process. Be good at all of the interactions, because literally anything you do to introduce delay or friction in the process can move the investor from a yes to a no. This is especially critical right now. If you do choose to fundraise in this environment, you don't want to do anything to decrease the likelihood of investment, because the likelihood of investment overall has gone down. Understand how to not pester, but to stay on the radar of the investor is important. And then working through handling objections. So can you get an investor to commit while noting the objections that they have, and then working as hard as you can to address those. One of the things that can be really powerful with investors is understanding what their process is. One way to also gauge how interested they are is ask them, what's your process from here? What are the next steps? Talk to me about how you like, what's your preferred way to interact with entrepreneurs as they're fundraising? And then get them to enumerate their process. Note that on the card that you're using or in the CRM system around that investor, so you understand what their discrete phases are. This is less important for angel investing, definitely important for institutional investing, is unlike sales, where you're trying to get a prospect to a customer as fast as possible, and you generally put all your energy into moving the most likely customer to close. With investors, what you're trying to do is align on timing. So instead of getting each investor to yes as fast as possible, you want to try to understand their process, the timing around it, so that the extent possible, it's not always possible to do this, but that you get term sheets or you get investor yeses at about the same time, so you have multiple options that you can evaluate. And again, that's where a process view is really powerful. So you can get a visual sense of where you're at in the process with each investor, and then in aggregate with your investment process as a whole. Anna, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I'll just add, Alex just asked a great question around if an investor passed, they invest at a later stage if you hit additional traction or progress. And definitely yes, that's why Zach kind of mentioned being really, really diligent notes. So if they say no, ask them why. And if it's, I need $1 million in annual revenue and you hit that, reach back out to them. A couple other thoughts. As Zach kind of talks about this, it's a mix of an art and a science. So we're kind of talking about the science part and these formulas you can send, and also just the art part is being human and being empathetic and building real relationships, and just double clicking on how Zach talked about this is as much you doing due diligence on them as them on you. And so every email you respond to, like that's part of their due diligence and part of them seeing like, oh, it took them 24 hours, it took them 20 minutes, it took them 2 weeks. But the same is for you and them too. So if they're being, if they're going dark and being unresponsive and things like this, think about that as kind of red flags potentially on how they're responding as well. And also, I think especially now, Zach kind of talked about de-risking kind of some of the things investors are going to want to see to think about risk. They're going to want to know your plan, given the current market, and they're going to want to know, how are you going to make it to 2021? How are you reducing your burn rate right now? How are you extending your runway? And so there's going to be an additional set of questions that investors are going to be wanting to know around your ability to survive and thrive during a downturn, and kind of so be ready with those questions in addition to kind of a lot of the stuff Zach talked about today. And then I think for sustainability, I really want to emphasize that people in sustainability are working on really big problems and problems that are going to be around after this crisis and after things settle down. Climate change still will exist, and so I think there's a lot of opportunities in this space, and I think investors know that as well. And so I just want to encourage you all not to give up in the sustainability and the work, and lean on support systems like Techstars and other organizations that can help you kind of navigate new markets during these times. And maybe that's investors, maybe that's key mentors, and it's just another great way to build relationships is by asking for help, and also helping other entrepreneurs in these sectors. So.
Great, thanks for that. Appreciate all of you for attending today. Again, I'll be making a video of this available and sending it out to you. Again, we appreciate all the work you're doing in this space, and thank you for joining us today.
And I'll just say next week we're going to have 3 investors join us. So we'll have an angel investor, someone from the foundation side in the climate world, and a traditional kind of VC that invests in climate. So please, I hope you can join us with our special guests and come ready for questions with them, as we'll try to do a lot of Q&A with you all. If you need anything, reach out in the meantime.